So David is an expert in crisis communications, and I have worked with him on a number of occasions. And most recently, David and I were involved in working with the senior leadership team at the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services on the communication and community engagement response on COVID during the second lockdown. So if you do have questions during that session, I do encourage you to ask them. I should be well positioned to answer them for you. So as a founder and managing director of Socom, he's a multi-award winning strategic communicator. He has more than 30 years experience in issues and crisis management. He's highly regarded in his field, and he's a recipient of the prestigious Business Issues Award that IABC has as part of its Gold Quill process. And that award is generally given to the best of the best for that particular year. Some of the higher profile issues and crises that David has worked on include the federal government's independent panel to review the home insulation scheme, which was known as Pink Bats. Also Master Foods Australia, New Zealand, now Mars, the extortion threat. The Victorian Building Authority's response to the Black Saturday bushfire. The City of Casey here in Melbourne, their management of the Cranbourne methane incident. He also assisted the ABS with the website shutdown of that infamous census night in 2016. And he's also worked on marriage equality postal survey. He was asked to join the Prime Minister's Cybersecurity Task Force after developing a crisis communication plan for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He's also an accredited lead auditor for business continuity management, and he's an associate with the Melbourne Business School of Management, providing crisis response training for the MBA program there. He's also an author of Valuing Relationships, a common sense approach to improving business outcomes, and is currently completing his PhD researching techniques to improve effective crisis response and crisis communication. So I think we have, one of the leading experts in this space here today. So I'd like to welcome the session with David. Over to you guys.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name's David Hawkins. I work with a company called Socom. I've been working with them since 1995, doing a lot of crisis and issues management work. And what I want to do today is talk about how do we create an effective communications response in a time of crisis. And by effective, I mean that that's also going to be responsive and agile. And I've broken the presentation down into 4 key areas. How do we communicate with purpose? And that's really sort of a key part for me, and that's really going to be the foundation on which we build the rest of the communications on. The other parts are maximising engagement, managing multiple demands across multiple channels, and then balancing transparency with the need to manage the potential for heightened anxiety. So that's the content. This is my first recorded presentation ever. Unfortunately, I can't be with you while this is going to screen. So here we go. I want to kick off with communicating with purpose, and I want to ask this question. Why do we communicate? What's the purpose of communication? I want you to think about that for a moment, because unless we get this right, it's going to be hard to sort of build on. So what I'd like you to do in the next 30 seconds or minute is move or turn to your neighbour and ask them the question, why do you think we communicate? And when they give you an answer, let them ask you the same question. And let's see if we can come up with a shared opinion of why we communicate. I've asked that question a lot in a lot of different forums, and I get a lot of different responses about delivering key messages, delivering information. And sometimes, occasionally, I get the response that I'm looking for. Because when people say we need to communicate messages, I say, well, why do we need to do that? What's the purpose of those messages? What's the purpose of the communication, which is what I'm asking you? And finally, we get to a response is, well, communication exists to influence behaviour. That's why we provide information. That's why we provide our key messages. Ultimately, it's to influence behaviour. So if we actually look at purpose and the effectiveness of a communications response in a time of crisis, what we need to do for it to be effective, for it to have purpose, is we then need to link it to some behavioural outcome. Now, that's a quantum shift for a lot of people who are doing crisis communication, because they're usually just sort of fed a whole lot of information and get this out. But we need to continually ask ourselves the question, why? Why are we doing this? Why do I need to get this information out? What's the outcome that I'm trying to achieve in response to this crisis? Now, if we look at COVID as a recent example, and if we look at the government's response and what some of the behavioural outcomes might have been, it's making sure people got tested if they didn't feel well. It's about making sure people had good hand hygiene and wore masks, made sure people stayed home when they were quarantining. So there were lots of key outcomes that the government was looking to achieve. And then those outcomes then gave the communications their purpose. So I want to also sort of talk about this concept of purpose and outcomes in relation to reputation management. So I want us to think about our own reputation. I want to think about the reputation of the organisation. And, what are some of the factors that what are some of the factors that will influence that reputation? So again, I want you to turn to your other neighbour, or, if at the end, turn to the person behind you and ask that question. And see if you can come up with ideas about the things that impact our reputation. But let's move on with reputation management. What is a reputation? If we look at the definition of reputation, what we see, or what it says, is it's the beliefs or opinions that are generally held about someone or something. And these are usually influenced by what we have seen or heard or experienced in some way. Now, when we think about this, there are two components. So there's the facts that we know, we might have experienced that, we might have read directly, or there's the rumours, the things that we might have read or heard, and we're not sure about the validity of some of that information. I want to deal with the facts first and then the rumours later on in the presentation. So let's look at it this way. An incident's happened. What are the facts? Well, something's happened. It happened at this place and it happened at this time. Any impact on reputation so far? Well, there may be, because we want to ask the question, well, why did it happen? Is there an error? Is there a failure of an organisation's risk management system or some system that allowed this to happen? We might not know that for weeks and weeks and weeks. So the impact that those facts have is going to be minimal. So then we've got to move on. So what's the organisation doing about it? And we look at the facts about what the organisation is doing, and that is going to have, those actions are going to have a massive impact on the reputation of the organisation. Are they doing enough? Are they not doing enough? And you can we can talk. But before I do that, I just want to look at some research. And this research, and the graph that you can see on the screen now, is something that's come out of the Edelman Trust Barometer. And for those who aren't familiar, hopefully most of you are, it's a very large piece of research that happens on an annual basis in about, I think, 47 or so countries. About 30,000 people participate. And one of the things that they started to look at is, what are some of the factors that impact a reputation in a crisis? And what you can see here is that if the organisation shows genuine care and empathy, that's taking up 50% of our abilities to retain trust in the organisation and maintain a good reputation. Hopefully enhance the reputation of an organisation. So when there is an incident, when there's a crisis, are we showing genuine care and empathy for those people who are impacted by the incident? And if we are, then we're on a very good pathway. How do we relate that then back to our communication? That's the basis, that's the foundation for our effective communication. It's not empty air, it's not spin, it's genuine content. We can tell people what we're doing. We can tell people what we need them to do. Ultimately, the goal is to reduce the negative impact on our organisation, and we can do that by reducing the negative impact on others. So we need to be sharing what we are doing to try and reduce that impact for key stakeholders. There's another way of thinking about effective crisis communication as well. And this links back to three important questions. And I ask this time and time again when we're working with clients. The first thing is, what's happened? Again, something happened, where and when. Okay, what are you doing about it? Absolutely critical. And then they will tell me what they're doing about it. And then the third thing, and the most important question of all, which links back to our communication and our reputation, is, are you proud of what you're doing? Or to put it in another way, if you were in the shoes of the person who was impacted by the crisis, would you feel that they're doing enough? If it was your parents, if it was your children, if it was you, would you feel that the organisation is doing enough? So does it pass the pub test? Effective communication means we are telling our audiences, the people who've been impacted by the incident, what we are doing to take care of people, what we're doing to take care of them, what we need them to do to take care of themselves as well, and also what we're doing to rectify the situation. I want to share a story with you as an example. So there was one of the case studies was of a builder. They built about 1,000 homes a year. In one of their homes, a home in Dandenong, they installed the oven. The family moved in. It was a new family to Australia, a Sudanese family. And the mother was cooking this big pot of soup on the stove. And, she was stirring the boiling soup. The oven door was open. And one of the young children came along, and they sort of pushed down on the oven door, and the oven tilted forward to the extent that the soup then tipped over all over the child. So the child has boiling soup all over. The child's rushed to hospital. That's the emergency. The child is now in a stable condition. We need to ask ourselves the question, what's the outcomes that we want to achieve? Because this is going to be the foundation of our communication. So the outcomes. The first thing is we need to make sure that the boy has the best medical care. That's the first outcome. The second outcome is that we need to make sure that the family is supported. And in this particular instance, that there needs to be one of the parents needed to stop working, and so that they could spend time with the son. And the company provided some income support for that. In terms of the best medical care, they flew the best burn specialist from Sydney down to Melbourne to see the child. So it didn't change where the child location was. They paid for the burn specialist to come down. And then the third thing is to prevent it from happening again in any other home. And so there was a lot of, especially that last one, there was a lot of communication to achieve that outcome. Now, with this particular instance, and with some of the other crises as well, there's usually an obstacle, or it's a particular profession that likes to stand in the way of effective communication. And I'm sure you can probably all guess what that is. It is the lawyers. So how do we actually deal with that situation as well? I want to put another graph up. But what we see, this is some study that was done by Knight and Pretty, and it was done in the States. And what they did is they looked at the implications of an effective and ineffective crisis response. And what they saw in terms of shareholder value, so these are all publicly listed companies, is that the shareholder value, or the share price, after an incident went down. Didn't matter if it was a good response or a bad response, it went down. But you can see then, in the sort of 5 to 10 days after the incident, people are making the assessment of whether or not the response has been good. Has the organisation done enough? Have they communicated what they've done? And if they had done enough, you can see that the organisation started to recover. Share price went up. If they didn't, if they hadn't done enough, then share price went down. And at the end of that year, there is a 25% differential between shareholder value. Now that red line that you can see there, that represents Dreamworld. And as you can see, that it's just a slippery slide. And Arden Leisure's share price, I think, is currently something like 60% below where it was during the Dreamworld incident. So with this organisation, the builder, that's turning over about 300 million a year, it was quite clear to say, well, what's the worst case scenario if we stuff up our communication with the family and with everybody else? Well, there could be a lawsuit, could be around about 2 to 4 million. Well, if we look at this piece of research, we can see that the turnover, 25% of 300 million is 75 million. So now you're faced with a choice. We don't communicate, and we might risk 2 to 4 million, or we do communicate. We don't communicate and we risk 75 million, or we do communicate, we get it wrong and we risk 4 million. So that was a way of demonstrating that there was a tangible benefit of doing an effective communications response, or an effective response, an effective communications response, which is what they did. The other example I want to look at, which is quite recent, is the rape in Parliament House in Canberra. And I apologise if this or any of the case studies that I talk about causes distress for anyone, but this one certainly did for me. We've now had 2 people who've come out and alleged that a rape took place. And what we hear is that there was no action after the first alleged incident. No action. And as a result, we have, well, not as a direct result, but we now have another alleged incident as well. Now, as a father, the first incident was horrific. But to think that anybody tried to brush this under the carpet is absolutely abhorrent. And in terms of the reputation of anybody associated with trying to brush anything under the carpet, as far as I'm concerned, it's all over, Red Rover. They should never be in public office. It's just appalling. And you can see that sort of level of response because the actions as a result of an incident, it doesn't meet my expectations. I was involved in another rape case. I'm not involved in this one, but I was involved in another one last year. The response was completely different. Another tragic event, but the response from the organisation was so supportive to the victim, was so, they did everything they possibly could to make sure that this would never happen again. And so we've got 2 ends of the spectrum, and that's going to have an impact on the reputation of both of those organisations. So in summary, my first topic, communicate with purpose. After there's been an incident, you need to assess the situation as quickly as you can. Once you've got a thorough understanding, or the best understanding that you can, you need to determine which stakeholders have been impacted. And then you need to decide what outcome you will try and achieve to show genuine care and empathy and support for those people. They're your actions. That's communicating with purpose. That's going to make sure that you've got a solid foundation for all of your communications, across all of your channels, across whatever you're doing. If you don't have that, if you're trying to communicate with spin or, with fluff, you're going to get into trouble. And it doesn't matter, what you're saying or where you're saying it, you get into trouble. So you have to communicate with substance, with purpose, for it to be effective. So here ends the first, but for me, the most important lesson, based on, all the experience that I've had and all the crises that I've had. I haven't got time, unfortunately, to share with you some of the bad experiences where an organisation hasn't done the right thing, and they live with the consequences of that for years to come. Okay, let's move on to the second, which is, just jumped off my screen. Okay, how do we maximise our engagement during a time in crisis, and how important is it? Firstly, it's important to get information out, but we also talked about being responsive and being agile. So how do we maximize our engagement? And like understanding the purpose of communication, we need for each incident to understand the purpose of the engagement. So the engagement is making sure we're providing people with the right information. So the impact of people with the right information in a timely way. Now, why do I call that engagement, not just communication? Because this has to be two-way. We have to listen to the key stakeholders, and we need to be effective in understanding what they know and what they don't know. How do we do that? Well, we reach out and we actively listen. Whether we do it online or offline, there are multiple ways of doing this, but we have to embed in our communication an opportunity to be agile and be responsive if people haven't felt that they haven't actually understood what we're trying to say, or we haven't understood what their needs are. There's 2 examples I want to give here. The first one is Vector in New Zealand. in, I think it was April 2018, Vector, which is a power distribution company, had a major blackout, and that blacked out around 200,000 homes. Some of those homes were without power for more than 2 weeks. However, customers were told that they would have the power back on in 4 hours due to an automated response from their app. That they produced. Great app, but it failed. The app was turned off after a couple of days. So what we saw, and we were asked to go in about 3 months after that to do a review of the communications of a crisis and give them a report about how they could improve some of their systems. So when we looked at a lot of their communications material, and this is about being responsive and about engaging, it was all one way. And one of the things that all of their communications usually contained a sort of a key message was, this was the worst storm on record. Saying, well, this was outside our control. Now, the fact of the matter was, it wasn't the worst storm on record, because I went back through some of the weather records and found that there had been a couple of others that have been just as bad or worse. But it certainly impacted that area. It's completely irrelevant. People don't want to know where this storm sits in the spectrum of worst storms on record. What do they want to know? They want to know where they can have a shower. They want to know where they can get food, what to do with the stuff that's in the freezer. They want to know when the power is coming back on. So there was a real disconnect between what the organisation was telling people and what their needs were. So it really wasn't active engagement. And it comes back to the actions rather than the comms. It was trying to sort of say, look at us, we're trying to deal with the worst storm on record, rather than, you poor things, what can we do to support you? The other example I want to do is some research that was done during the Mars extortion. And what we did in terms of engaging, we used focus groups. We did focus groups I think it was about every 2 nights we did that to get some quantitative feedback, and we also did some quantitative once a week. So we'd go out to the focus groups and we'd ask people, did they know this? What did they need to know? And that guided our communication. So it was really driven by the needs of the particular groups rather than the things that we wanted to say. And I think the other interesting point in this case is that talking about engagement, the organisation couldn't get out as quickly as they'd like to get all the Mars and Snickers products back. So we actively engage with the community, the New South Wales community, say, if you see a Mars bar anywhere, call this number and we'll have someone to come out and pick it up straight away. So that sort of changed a little bit about the sort of us and them we're all in this together. We need your help. And what you can see from the graph that's up on screen is from a fairly low start, by the end of it, 42% felt that the organisation had done more than what they expected them to. 54% said they've done roughly the right thing, so that hadn't changed. And down at the other end, only 4% felt that they waited too long. So that was a great outcome, and it shows. And I think from my perspective, when I look at some of the crisis response, there is not enough engagement that happens through research or through online or offline research to actually help formulate the messaging and the communications material. When products went back on shelf 7 weeks afterwards, sales went up by 250%, and they stayed that way for almost 4 months. So there's a fantastic return again in terms of doing a good and effective communications response and actively engaging with some of the key stakeholders, in this case, the customers. Okay, where are we up to? Okay, managing multiple channels managing multiple demands across multiple channels. There are always going to be 101 channels that you can use, but the demands, are going to be far less. So this is my advice, and don't try and provide multiple information sources across multiple channels. Make sure you generate a single source of trusted information and make this the point of truth, and then use all the channels to say this is where you can find the information. On that point of truth, if it's on your website, if emergency services have posted something, put in a link to that. If there are other agencies that have done something, put in a link to that. So you can actually have it almost as a news feed. Make sure it's easy to navigate. If there's been a particularly good news article that you think has happened, put that in as well. So all I need to do as an impacted person is come to your website, and that's where all the information is. I might find out about it from Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of the other platforms, but rather than try and provide all that information on the different platforms, you can have a central source of trusted information. So that's your website, and you can control it. And then you can promote it through all your online and your offline channels. One of the things that's also important to do is you can start owning hashtags. You'll see that some of the hashtags that start to trend, and one of the ones that we sort of dealt with was census fail after the 2016 website crash. ABS, when I was talking to ABS after that, I said, what does census fail mean to you? And there was probably about 30 different responses. And I said, well, if you can't provide a definition of what census fail means to you, how can you expect there to be a sort of central understanding of what happened? So try and own a hashtag, and even if it's not necessarily particularly positive to you, you can then still provide some corrective information by using it. Another example, if we look at down as Berries, they shut the website down when the hepatitis B recall. They spent millions of dollars building the profile of this particular website and the particular brand, but then when there was a problem, they just shut the website down. It wasn't a good look. They've been sold to an offshore company. Don't know what price, but I can't imagine it's much. One of the other things I want to sort of talk about is building the brand of your spokesperson. During the Mars Snickers one, we as I said, we're doing the quantitative research, and towards the end of it, we were trying to work out who would the best spokesperson would be to say it's now you can go back and start eating Mars bars, Snickers bars, and you can sort of see from this graph. We thought it might be journos, because that's what happened with Arnott's, scientists, police, but with the journos, you had John Laws, Alan Jones, Cash for Comment. And what we did throughout the whole campaign was build the brand of Andy Weston Webb, who was the Masterfoods CEO. We spent a lot of time putting up on video news releases and community service announcements. We put him everywhere. So he was the face. And what we found is that he became a very, very trusted source of information. He had a fantastic brand. And by the end, you can see it was... he was the one that people wanted to hear from. So, when it came back on shelf, he was our primary source. We didn't use any externals. It was all internals. And as I said, sales were back 250%. So last thing is balancing transparency with the need to manage potential for heightened anxiety. And I just sort of want to say this. How many times have you heard people complaining that they've had too much information? Oh, yes, they sent us too much information. This is a bit of a furphy for me. Don't treat people like mushrooms. Not far from Melbourne, we've got a hazardous waste facility. It's only 30 k's from Melbourne, and you've all heard about the toxic waste dumps. We don't want them. We've got one. It's Class A. It's more toxic than a lot of the others. The only reason we got community acceptance was because we provided them with all the information, all the risks, so that they had a good understanding about the benefits and the risks associated with this particular project. And when one of the councillors in an election stood up and said, we don't want Mount Toxic in our backyard, it was the community that shut him down. If there's misinformation online, correct it. Only do it once online. Don't enter into an online debate. I learned that from the Red Cross at a presentation where they said, we only respond once to misinformation, and then we go into private messaging. We don't ever get into an argument online about what's right or what's wrong. So if you're going to have an effective crisis response, these are some of the key points. Demonstrate care and empathy in your communication. Make sure it's reflective of what you're doing as your response. Make sure your actions are communicated. Be the first with the news. It's much easier to be agile if you're the first out there with the news than if you're trying to catch up. It might not be the best news, like with Mars and Snickers, where people were starting to get sick. We had to be the first to talk about it. Because if not, other people will. Be honest. Respond to your audience's needs. Use multiple channels, but have a single point of information, a trusted point of, a trusted source of information. Don't be afraid of the media, especially if you're proud of what you're doing. They're just a channel to communicate that. And don't be afraid to say sorry, especially if you're ashamed of what you've done. I've covered a lot in a fairly short amount of time, so thank you very much. I wish I could be there for questions, but unfortunately I can't. But if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to sort of take those offline. So either communicate with me directly or through the conference organisers, or can help with that. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you, David. I'm really pleased to hear David share his insights and years of experience. As I said, I had the pleasure of working with David recently on in our second lockdown here in Melbourne, and we're deep in the midst of it. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free to do so in the chat, either in the discussion forum or in the Q&A section. So I'm trying to control two screens at the same time, so it's a bit awkward. So a couple of the key things that he mentioned that really struck me that I thought was really interesting. It's the piece about the purpose of engagement. So I will refer back to the COVID-19 response that we worked on together. So I worked on the strategic communication framework for comms for the whole department for COVID, and David worked on crisis and the governance piece around it, in terms of helping us, helping the whole team really pull together consistent work in that space. And we then I developed the outbreak response framework, or the playbook you could call it, on how to respond to any outbreaks from a communication and community engagement perspective. So that was tested at the end of the second wave, as we're in that second step, going towards a third step for the road to recovery, and in subsequent outbreaks. The key thing about it is to really, really work on the community engagement piece in that case, because there's obviously an external crisis, and really understand and connect with the community as frequently as possible. Really spend the time listening and talking with them, and listening to what is it that they really need, what is it that they want, and then framing your response in relation to that from a communication perspective. We listened to them, we knew if there was a mistake made, we accepted, moved on, heard from them, co-created with them. They ended up working with us and becoming our messengers as well. So we worked really, really closely with it, and we couldn't have done it without working very closely with the people that were most impacted. So that was a huge lesson from a crisis response perspective. The other aspect of it was to be as prepared as you possibly can. So we did look at what were all the potential issues. We did look at risks. We ascertained what was the risk appetite that we could deal with. And obviously each organisation has a different risk appetite in terms of what you can go out with, in terms of what you can communicate with, and what you can, the voice that you can have in your communication. So that was really quite important piece to remember. The other piece I thought was interesting was when he was talking about the source of truth, having that single source of truth. So trying to put all your communication in one place, but then being able to ensure that those who are impacted and the people who are most likely to influence those people were able to access it and also be able to use it themselves to be able to communicate the message, because you cannot get through every single point of contact possible. So we found, for example, working with different types of communities from different backgrounds, that they all, that they might have been listening more to friends and relatives or specific people within their community. So we had to work with them to make sure that we were getting the right messages out and dealing with misinformation as it was happening. So it had to be very, very fast, very quick. And ultimately, there's an element of get it out there. It might not be perfect, but get it out there as soon as you can and make sure that you're honest. The other piece of information that I thought was interesting when he was talking about building the brand of the spokesperson, in the COVID response, for example, our Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, is very much front and centre and trusted, and is great as a communicator. And at the beginning of the crisis, way back earlier on in the piece, the one thing that he said across the board was the one thing that's really going to help, with all other things being equal, to help us deal with this crisis is communication. So we have to get communication right. Communication and engagement is critical to have behaviour change. And unless we have behaviour change, we cannot deal with this. So he put communication front and centre, and he knew the impact of it. So from that position, we were well placed to work with someone like that to be able to communicate what we needed to over time. So I'm just conscious of time. We've got 3 minutes. I'm just going to comment on something here. So Emma Lang asked the question, what was the research that specified finances returned 60% when crisis comms was done well? I think he was referring to the Knight and Pretty research there. So I will get that confirmed and put it in the conversation after this. So I'll check in with him to make sure I've got the right reference. Best ways to assess trust levels in your spokesperson to help determine who should it be. I think you need to, looking at that, in our case, we knew that we had to reference, go back to the expert in the space in particular, because it's the expert with the scientific background. So when it came to COVID, that would be our Chief Health Officer. So, and if at the moment there's, in the COVID response, we have now developed different teams dealing with that as we've moved into the COVID normal time. So there's another one called Ben Cowie. He's a Deputy Chief Health Officer who is also amazing. He's an expert in the space. He understands comms, he understands engagement, and he's very comfortable in front of the camera. The other one, Alan Cheng, the other Deputy Health Officer, he's fantastic. He's got a different style, but we helped him, we trained him in terms of how to address media and deal with that. So it's about putting in that effort into working with the specific spokesperson and working out who that's going to be. You can test the waters, I think. So we have 53 seconds left from what I can see. So I'll close up this session. So his key points were communicating with purpose, get the purpose of the engagement right, build the brand of that spokesperson, and make sure that you're balancing transparency with the need to deal with the heightened level of anxiety. And top of that, I thought was really important is demonstrate care and empathy. And I think that's really come through in business, dealing with crisis at the moment through COVID, because, you know, we are the only institution, according to Edelman, that has actually shown that it is both ethical and competent, which is a fantastic thing. So we should be really proud of that.